"They broke into my barn," I roared, my voice echoing across the dusty driveway of my Tennessee farm. My name's Jake, a third-generation farmer who's seen tornadoes, droughts, and even a runaway tractor. But nothing prepared me for the audacity of my HOA that Saturday evening. I'd been in town all day, hauling feed and fixing a fence, dreaming of a quiet night with a cold beer and my dog, Rusty. Instead, I pulled up to my property and found my barn, a weathered red-painted haven of hay, tools, and memories, transformed into a circus. Music thumped so loud it rattled my truck's windows. Colored lights flashed through the cracks in the barn walls, and cars I didn't recognize lined my gravel road. My heart sank as I realized what was happening. My HOA, led by the insufferable Karen, had taken over my barn for an unauthorized community party. I jumped out of my truck, boots crunching on the gravel, and stormed toward the barn. The closer I got, the worse it looked. My padlocked gate was wide open, the chain cut clean through with bolt cutters. My no trespassing sign was tossed in the dirt, smeared with tire marks. Inside, I could hear laughter, clinking glasses, and some awful pop song blaring. My barn wasn't just a storage space, it was my livelihood. It housed my tractor, my winter hay, and, most importantly, my two 2,000-pound bulls, Brutus and Tank, who were not fond of strangers. The thought of those animals, already ornery on a good day, being disturbed by a mob of HOA busybodies made my blood boil. As I reached the barn door, I peeked inside and saw the full extent of the invasion. At least 50 people, none of whom I'd ever invited, were dancing, drinking, and treating my property like their personal nightclub. Hay bales I'd stacked for winter feed were shoved into a corner to make a rustic photo booth, complete with fairy lights and a chalkboard sign that read HOA Harvest Bash. My tools, meticulously organized, were scattered across the floor, some kicked under tables loaded with snacks and red plastic cups. Worst of all, I spotted Karen, the HOA president, strutting around in a bright red dress, holding a glass of wine and barking orders like she owned the place. Karen had been a thorn in my side since I moved here 2 years ago, always complaining about my unkempt farm or noisy livestock. This, though, wasn't just her usual nitpicking. This was war. I pushed through the crowd, ignoring the confused looks from HOA members who probably thought I was just another guest. "Karen!" I shouted, my voice barely cutting through the music. She turned, her fake smile faltering when she saw me. "Jake, darling," she chirped, as if we were old friends. "Isn't this fabulous? We needed a venue, and your barn was just perfect." I clenched my fists, trying to stay calm. "You broke into my property," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "Get out, now." But Karen just laughed, waving a manicured hand. "Oh, don't be so dramatic. It's just one night, and it's for the community. You really should be more neighborly." That's when I noticed the pen in the far corner of the barn. Brutus and Tank, my massive Angus bulls, were locked in a flimsy side enclosure, their eyes wild with agitation. Someone had tied a rope around the gate to secure it, as if that could hold back 4,000 pounds of muscle. The bulls were snorting, pawing the ground, their horns glinting under the party lights. These weren't pets. They were working animals, bred for strength, and they didn't take kindly to strangers, let alone a noisy crowd. The sight of them, stressed and confined, while Karen and her cronies partied without a care, pushed me past my breaking point. I wasn't just mad anymore. I was ready to fight back. I stepped outside to clear my head, my hands shaking with rage. The evening air was cool, but it did little to calm me. I looked back at the barn, the music still pounding, and realized reasoning with Karen was pointless. She'd never respect my boundaries. That's when my eyes landed on Brutus and Tank's pen through the barn's side window. A crazy, reckless idea started to form, one that could either be the best or worst decision of my life. If the HOA thought they could take over my barn, maybe it was time they met its real residents. I muttered to myself, Let's see how. They like a party with 2,000-pound bulls. My heart pounded as I started planning my next move. Karen's vendetta against me started the day I moved to this so-called planned community on the edge of my farmland. I'd bought the property, a sprawling 20 acres with a century-old barn, because it was far enough from town to feel like freedom, but close enough to sell my produce. The HOA, however, had other plans. Karen, a self-appointed dictator in a red blazer, saw my farm as a blemish on her vision of suburban perfection. From the start, she bombarded me with complaints. My tractor was an eyesore parked in my own driveway. My roosters, crowing at dawn as roosters do, were a public disturbance. She even claimed my split-rail fence violated some obscure rule about aesthetic harmony, demanding I replace it with a white picket monstrosity. Each letter arrived on crisp HOA letterhead, signed with her loopy signature, dripping with condescension. I'd ignored them, tossing the fines in a drawer, figuring she'd burn herself out. But breaking into my barn, that was a new level of audacity. As I stood outside the barn, the music pounding and laughter spilling out, I overheard Karen's voice through an open window. "Jake's barn is practically community property," she told a group of partygoers, her tone smug. "He doesn't maintain it properly, so we're doing him a favor by sprucing it up." My jaw dropped. Maintain it? That barn was my pride. And joy. Sure, the paint was peeling, and the loft creaked, but every inch was clean, organized, and functional. I'd spent years restoring it, from patching the roof to reinforcing the beams. It housed my tractor, my winter hay, and my two bulls, Brutus and Tank, who were more than livestock. They were partners in keeping this farm alive. To hear Karen dismiss it as some abandoned shed she could claim for her harvest bash felt like a slap in the face. I pushed through the barn door, weaving past tipsy HOA members in khakis and polo shirts, their faces unfamiliar. The scene inside was worse than I'd imagined. They'd dragged my hay bales into a corner, draped them with cheap tablecloths, and set up a selfie station with a sign that read, "Country Chic." My tools, hammers, wrenches, a pitchfork I'd inherited from my granddad, were kicked under tables littered with plastic cups and half-eaten cupcakes. Someone had spilled punch on my workbench, staining the wood I'd sanded myself. The air smelled of cheap perfume and cheaper wine, a far cry from the usual scent of hay and earth. But what made my heart race was the sight of Brutus and Tank in their pen. The bulls were pacing, their massive heads tossing, their hooves scraping the dirt. Someone had tied a flimsy rope around the gate, as if that could hold back 4,000 pounds of muscle. These weren't cuddly farm animals. They were bred for strength, and they hated crowds. One wrong move, and someone could get hurt. I marched up to Karen, who was posing for photos with a group of her cronies. "You need to get these people out of here," I said, my voice tight. She turned, her smile as fake as her spray tan. "Oh, Jake, lighten up," she chirped, swirling her wine. "This is for the community. You should be grateful we're bringing some class to this rustic situation." She gestured at my barn like it was a dump. I pointed at the bulls. "You locked my livestock in a corner and broke into my property. This ends now." She rolled her eyes. "Don't be so dramatic. It's just one night, and we're not hurting anything." Her friends nodded, smirking, as if I were the unreasonable one. That's when I saw red. Karen didn't just disrespect me. She endangered my animals and trashed my livelihood. I thought about calling the sheriff, but the nearest deputy was 30 minutes away, and Karen would spin some story about community rights. I'd tried reasoning with her before, meetings, emails, even a polite request to leave my farm alone. But she always twisted it, painting me as the grumpy farmer who hated progress. The HOA board, a clique of her loyal followers, backed her every move. I glanced at the bulls again, their eyes glinting with agitation. These city folks had no idea what they'd walked into. Karen's arrogance, her refusal to see my farm as anything but a backdrop for her ego, lit a fire in me. I wasn't going to let her win this time. I stepped outside, the cool night air doing little to quell the fire in my chest. My hands shook, not from fear, but from the realization that Karen and her HOA cronies wouldn't stop unless I made them. Words hadn't worked. I'd tried reasoning. At HOA meetings, sending polite emails, even swallowing my pride to ask her to leave my farm alone. Each time Karen twisted it, painting me as the grumpy farmer who hated community spirit. The sheriff was too far away, and Karen would spin some tale about shared spaces. No, this needed something bolder, something unforgettable. As I paced in the dark, my boots kicking up dust, my eyes locked onto the barn's side window. Through it, I saw Brutus and Tank, my 2,000-pound Angus bulls, shifting restlessly in their pen. Their massive heads tossed, horns glinting under the party lights, their hooves scraping the dirt in agitation. That's when it hit me, a plan so wild it might just work. If the HOA wanted my barn, they could share it with its real residents. Brutus and Tank weren't pets, they were forces of nature. I'd seen them bust through a wooden fence when a coyote got too close. Releasing them into the barn would send Karen and her wine-sipping posse running. I wasn't out to hurt anyone, just to scare them enough to never set foot on my property again. My heart pounded as I weighed the risks. The bulls could do serious damage if someone got in their way, but the barn's layout gave me control. It had one main door, a side exit near the pen, and a few high windows nobody could climb through. I could let the bulls loose, lock the main door, and keep the side exit clear for safety. The chaos would be contained, but the lesson would be loud and clear. I circled the barn, checking my plan. The main door was heavy oak, sturdy enough to hold with a padlock I kept in my truck. The side exit was narrow, perfect for me to slip through unnoticed. The pen's gate was secured with a flimsy rope, easy to undo. I pictured it, the bulls charging in, snorting and stomping, while Karen's harvest bash turned into a stampede of panic. I'd seen Brutus scatter a flock of crows with one snort. A crowd of HOA yuppies wouldn't stand a chance. But I had to be careful. I didn't want injuries, just a wake-up call. I'd give them a few minutes of chaos, then open the door and herd the bulls back. The HOA would learn that my farm wasn't their playground. I grabbed the padlock from my truck's glove box, its cold metal grounding me. My breath quickened as I ran through the plan again. Step 1, slip in through the side exit. Step 2, untie the pen's rope and get out of the bull's way. Step 3, lock the main door. Step 4, watch the HOA scatter. Step 5, let them out before things got out of hand. It was risky, sure, but the alternative, letting Karen think she could walk all over me, was worse. I glanced at the stars, whispering a half-joking prayer for forgiveness. "All right, boys," I muttered, picturing Brutus and Tank's massive forms. "It's showtime." I crept toward the side exit, my boots silent on the grass. The music's bass pulsed through the barn walls, masking my approach. I peeked inside, ensuring nobody was near the pen. The party was in full swing, people laughing, dancing, oblivious to the storm brewing. Karen stood on a hay bale, toasting the crowd like some queen of the suburbs. My stomach churned, but my resolve hardened. This wasn't just about the barn, it was about respect, about defending my home from people who thought they could take what wasn't theirs. I gripped the padlock, its weight a promise of justice. One last glance at the bulls, their eyes gleaming with pent-up energy, told me they were ready. So was I. The barn's side door creaked as I slipped inside, the music, a grating pop song, masking the sound. My pulse hammered in my ears, but I moved with purpose, weaving through shadows cast by the party's tacky string lights. The air was thick, with the smell of spilled wine, cheap perfume, and the faint, earthy scent of my bull's agitation. I crouched low, staying out of sight as I edged toward the pen in the barn's far corner. Brutus and Tank were pacing, their massive heads swinging, horns catching the light like polished blades. The pen's gate, secured with a laughably thin rope, trembled under their weight as they snorted and pawed the dirt. These weren't cuddly farm animals. They were 2,000-pound beasts, bred for power, and right now they were as fed up as I was. The HOA had no idea what they'd stirred up. I glanced at the partygoers, oblivious, laughing, snapping selfies by my hay bales. Karen stood on a makeshift stage of stacked crates, holding court with her wine glass, toasting community spirit. Her red dress glowed under the lights, her smirk infuriating. I took a deep breath, my fingers brushing the rope. This was it. One tug, and the bulls would be free. My plan was simple but precise. Release Brutus and Tank, let them charge into the crowd, then sprint to the main door and lock it with the padlock in my pocket. The side exit would stay clear for safety, but the main door's lock would trap the HOA in their own chaos for a few minutes, just long enough to make them regret stepping foot on my land. I untied the rope, my hands steady despite the adrenaline. The gate swung open, and Brutus moved first, his massive bulk surging forward like a freight train. Tank followed, his hooves shaking the floorboards. I dove behind a stack of hay bales, my heart in my throat as the bulls barreled into the barn's main space. The first scream pierced the air, a high-pitched wail that cut through the music. "What are those?" someone shrieked. The crowd froze for a split second, then erupted into pandemonics. Glasses shattered as tables were knocked over. Brutus snorted, lowering his horns at a group of dancers who scrambled backward, tripping over chairs. Tank, never one to be outdone, charged a table laden with snacks, sending cupcakes and punch flying in a glorious explosion of color. Karen's voice rose above the chaos, shrill and panicked. "Somebody do something!" she screamed, clambering onto a hay bale, her dress catching and tearing on the rough edges. Her wine glass hit the floor, red liquid pooling like a crime scene. I stifled a laugh as I sprinted for the main door. Weaving through the stampeding crowd, a man in a polo shirt bumped into me, his eyes wide with terror. "There are bulls in here!" he yelled, as if I didn't know. I reached the heavy oak door, slammed it shut with a satisfying thud, and snapped the padlock into place. The click of the lock felt like victory. Peering through a small window, I watched the scene unfold. Brutus stood in the center of the barn, snorting and tossing his head, his bulk blocking the path to the photo booth. A group of HOA members cowered behind an overturned table, clutching each other. Tank, meanwhile, had taken a liking to a folding chair, nudging it with his horns until it crumpled. Karen, still perched on her hay bale, waved her arms like a deranged conductor, shouting orders nobody followed. "Stay calm! Don't provoke them!" she yelled, but her voice cracked with fear. The music still blared, now absurdly out of place. As the bulls ruled the barn, I knew I couldn't let it go too far. The bulls weren't out to hurt anyone. They were just spooked and asserting their space. But a wrong move could turn this from a lesson into a disaster. I kept an eye on the side exit, ready to intervene if needed. For now, though, the HOA was learning exactly what happens when you mess with a farmer's livelihood. The chaos was controlled, the panic deserved. As I watched Karen's carefully curated party dissolve into a screaming, scrambling mess, I felt a grim satisfaction. This was my barn, my rules, and my bulls were making that crystal clear. 10 minutes felt like an eternity, but it was long enough. The screams from inside the barn had softened to frantic whispers, punctuated by the occasional bellow from Brutus or Tank. I stood outside, my breath steadying, the padlock key cold in my hand. Through the small window in the main door, I could see the wreckage of the HOA's harvest bash. Tables lay in splinters. The photo booth was a pile of crumpled hay and broken fairy lights, and Karen's carefully curated party was now a scene of pure survival. I'd made my point, but I wasn't cruel. I didn't want anyone hurt, just humbled. It was time to end this. I turned the key, the padlock clicking open with a satisfying snap. "Everybody out!" I shouted, swinging the heavy oak door wide. The HOA members didn't need a second invitation. They poured out like a herd spooked by a thunderstorm, some tripping over their own feet, others clutching torn jackets or missing shoes. A woman in a sparkly dress was sobbing, her mascara streaking, as she stumbled past. A man in a polo shirt who'd earlier been snapping selfies nearly knocked me over in his haste, muttering, "Those bulls are insane." I bit back a grin. They weren't insane. They were just doing what bulls do when you invade their space. Karen was the last to emerge, her red dress now a tattered mess, her hair sticking out like she'd been through a windstorm. She clung to the arm of a trembling HOA board member, her face a mix of fury and fear. "You're a maniac, Jake," she screeched, pointing a shaky finger at me. "You could have killed us. I'm calling my lawyer." I stepped closer, my voice calm but firm. "You broke into my barn, Karen. You cut my lock, endangered my livestock, and trashed my property. Try explaining that to a judge." Her mouth opened, then closed, her usual smugness replaced by a flicker of doubt. She knew I had her dead to rights. Trespassing, property damage, and reckless endangerment weren't exactly a winning case. I turned away, focusing on the bulls. Brutus and Tank were still snorting, but they'd calmed enough to stop charging. I grabbed a bucket of feed from the corner, shaking it to get their attention. "Come on, boys," I called, my voice steady. They lumbered toward me, their massive heads lowered, drawn by the familiar rattle of grain. I led them back to their pen through the side exit, securing the gate with a proper latch this time. The barn was a disaster, spilled punch, broken chairs, and hay scattered like confetti. But the bulls were safe, and that was what mattered. As I locked the pen, I glanced at the fleeing HOA members, some still casting terrified looks back at the barn. Lesson delivered. By morning, the story had spread like wildfire. My neighbors, real farmers, not HOA types, stopped by with coffee and grins, eager to hear the tale. "Heard you gave Karen's crew a proper scare," said Oldeye. Man Harris chuckling over his mug. "Wish I'd seen it." I laughed, but the cleanup weighed on me. The barn took days to restore, sweeping up glass, restacking hay, scrubbing punch stains off my workbench. Each splinter and smear was a reminder of Karen's arrogance, but also of my stand. I filed a formal complaint with the county that Monday, detailing the break-in, the property damage, and the danger to my livestock. I included photos of the cut padlock and trampled sign, along with a neighbor's security footage showing HOA members sneaking onto my property. The county took it seriously, and the HOA board was summoned for a hearing. Karen tried to spin it, of course. She sent a letter claiming the barn was abandoned and the party was a community service. But the evidence was ironclad, and the board backed off. They issued a formal apology, dropped all their petty fines against me, and replaced my broken padlock. Karen stopped coming around, her usual strut replaced by a quick shuffle whenever she saw me in town. The HOA's newsletter even ran a vague article about respecting private property, which made me smirk. My barn was mine again, and I'd made it clear, mess with a farmer, and you'll answer to his bulls. Looking back, maybe unleashing 4,000 pounds of angry bull was a bit extreme. I didn't want anyone hurt, and I'd planned it carefully to avoid disaster. But sometimes, when words fail and arrogance blinds, you need a lesson that hits hard. Brutus and Tank were that lesson, 2 tons of muscle that spoke louder than any HOA meeting. My farm's quiet now, the barn back to its creaky, hay-scented glory. Every time I walk past it, I pat the door and think of that night. If you've got a neighbor who's pushed you too far, you'll get it. Drop your wild stories in the comments below. What's the craziest thing you've done to stand your ground? And don't forget to like and subscribe for more farm chaos. Who knows what's next on this Tennessee dirt?